We read this morning from the Hebrew Bible, from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me! I am lost. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it, and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed, and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. When the earth roars, we stand in awe. That's what a commentator said last week about the Hawaiian volcano that has been spewing lava since early May. The news footage is terrifying, isn't it? Enormous fountains of bright orange lava jetting up to the skies, then falling to the ground and running into the ocean. And as new fissures open in the volcano, the island also trembles with earthquakes large and small. Indeed, the earth is roaring, and indeed the display of nature's force inspires awe, a word that is connected with dread and fear and veneration and wonder. When we say that our tuna sandwich was awesome, or that we hope our friends have an awesome afternoon, we underestimate what it really means to be awed. If you want to be awed, put yourself in the Hebrew Scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament. That is the land of storms and whirlwinds and earthquakes and mountains that smoke. In the Hebrew Bible, God's nostrils smoke. That literary landscape was drawn by people who had heard the earth roar. They were people who knew that God is truly awesome, with all the dread, fear, veneration, and wonder that evokes. We modern folk try to pile up layers of protection against nature, but the ancient Israelites readily acknowledged their lack of power against natural disasters. They knew something we often try to deny. In a face-to-face encounter with the true force of nature, humans are outmatched. To see mountains spewing fire and the earth splitting open is to see ourselves as we really are, very small and very helpless. No wonder that the God of the Hebrew Bible tends to show up as smoke and fire. A bush burns without being consumed. A pillar of cloud and fire goes before the Israelites to lead them out of Egypt. Crowned with lightning and flame, Mount Sinai smokes and trembles. To see God as fire and smoke was for the Israelites to see themselves as they really were, small and helpless. So imagine how Isaiah felt when he saw what he saw. I saw the Lord, says Isaiah, sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. How would you feel? This is the full-on physical manifestation of God. It is huge and it is weird. We don't even really know how weird, because we can't really picture these things that Isaiah calls seraphs. Here they sound something like the angels that we like to picture, humans with wings, but elsewhere in the Bible, seraphs might be snakes. If Isaiah saw the throne of God surrounded by 6-winged snakes, well, that is as weird as it gets. And it's not just sights, it's a full sensory experience, including loud chanting, deep shaking, and a house filled with smoke. What would your reaction be to sight and sound and feeling and smell? This would be the perfect opportunity to say, awesome. Or would you, like Isaiah, cry, woe is me? Because when Isaiah sees God, he also sees himself, and he doesn't like what he sees. I am a man of unclean lips, he cries. Unclean lips? Was it something Isaiah said? Could be. As Jesus would point out later in the Gospel of Matthew, it's the things that come out of our mouths that defile us, because they proceed from our hearts, and we all know what goes on in there. So yes, Isaiah likely bears some guilt, but maybe it goes deeper than that. Maybe it's not just that he's done something wrong. Maybe Isaiah believes that he is something wrong. If you've studied psychology or even read a couple of good self-help books, you know the distinction between guilt and shame. Guilt is feeling bad for what you've done. Shame is feeling bad for what you are. When Isaiah calls himself a man of unclean lips, that sounds like an identity. What's more, he lives among a people of unclean lips. Isaiah's shameful identity includes his environment and might even go back generations. For Isaiah, it may not be what he did, but who he is. And Isaiah is afraid, because someone who is all wrong, like him, should not have seen God. He is sure that the sight is going to kill him. Now the contrast between God and himself is overwhelming. As God's power looms larger and larger, Isaiah feels himself smaller and smaller, more and more helpless, and the more helpless he feels, the deeper his shame. Woe is me, I am lost. He waits for what he deserves, which is to be struck dead. And yet, instead of a death knell, he hears the beating of wings. All around him he feels the air disturbed as a strange 6-winged creature flutters and hovers, and as something bearing heat approaches his face. It's a coal, fresh from the altar fire. With astonishing gentleness, the seraph touches the coal to his lips. Isaiah doesn't say that it burned him. Perhaps he's stronger than he thought. And when the seraph says, now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out, Isaiah will be changed in ways he cannot imagine. Because the departure of the wrong that Isaiah has done gives him a new sense of who he is. More than guilt has departed, Isaiah is rescued from shame. And that changes his whole being. Just look at what happens next. For one thing, in addition to seeing the Lord, Isaiah can now hear the Lord speaking, and for some reason now that doesn't even frighten him. In fact, Isaiah, who was once afraid to see God, is now unafraid for God to see him. He even invites God's attention, because God isn't really speaking directly to him. God's just kind of thinking out loud, whom shall I send, and who will go for us? We imagine Isaiah raising his hand. Ooh, here am I, he says, send me. Isaiah, who believed himself powerless, now knows himself empowered. He who believed himself helpless is begging to be of help. Isaiah has gone from woe is me to send me. This is Isaiah's call story. Every prophet has one. And every prophet responds at first in pretty much the same way. God, you must be thinking of someone else. You want someone big and strong and smart. Not me. I can barely tie my own shoes. I am helpless. And because nothing shames a human like admitting helplessness, I'm also really ashamed. Count me out. How does that get turned around? What gets him from I'm a man of unclean lips to the idea that he can speak for God? Now maybe you've heard someone say, or maybe you might have said yourself, I don't like to read the Old Testament. I don't like that God. That God is too scary. That God is too fierce. All that fire and smoke. Give me gentle Jesus, meek and mild. Give me some grace. Well, friends, think again about that live coal. Now that this has touched your lips, says the seraph, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. That live coal cleansed Isaiah and removed his shame. And that sounds like grace to me. Grace gave Isaiah the courage to stand before God. And once he could stand, he discovered that he could also speak. The God who called him had also equipped him. That's how a call story works. Isaiah tells us that his call came in the year that King Uzziah died. Now, as with most biblical history, that's actually a pretty fuzzy date. But the date is not important. What's important is that a king died. Because when a king dies, the ground shifts. When a king dies, things change. In the history of Judah, what changed with King Uzziah's death was that the kingdom of Judah became more vulnerable to the mighty kingdom of Assyria. Armies went on the march. Politics trapped the people. Injustice was on the increase. Violence was in the air. At the same time, what changed in the life of Isaiah was discovering he was not helpless. God equipped him for service. God equipped him to speak. I dare say that we have all felt helpless in the face of great force. Lately, we seem to have experienced many natural disasters, each following one upon the other. It's like we're living in the Hebrew Bible. Earthquakes, tornadoes, volcanoes. We know how small we are in the face of great natural force. We see ourselves as helpless, and it's frightening. We also suffer of late one man-made disaster upon another. Missile strikes, chemical weapons attacks, nuclear threat, children shot in schools. Violence and destruction. As the prophet Jeremiah says, terror all around. The fact is, God is not the only force that sometimes fills the air with fire and smoke. And seeing the great force of evil also makes us see ourselves too clearly with all our own participation in evil, all our sin, all our guilt, and all our helplessness. Woe is we. Surely we are lost. Surely there is nothing we can do against all the evil, violence, and hurt in this world. But maybe this present age is like the year that King Uzziah died. Maybe this is the time of our call story. And if we're being called, should we not believe that God is equipping us to answer? What is that we feel all around our faces? the air disturbed by the beating of wings, the approach of something bringing heat, a coal fresh from the altar fire, something that might gently touch our lips, something that can cleanse us from guilt and thus remove our shame. When our shame is removed, we may realize that we are not helpless after all. If God calls us, God equips us. If grace equips us to stand before God, we can stand before anyone. We can stand and we can speak. We can speak for God. We can speak for love. We have the power that comes from grace. And grace is way more than amazing. Grace is awesome. Amen.